Zwei, drei, eins, zwei. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, and welcome to this my laboratory. Today I have an extraordinary case study for you. Very shortly a man shall enter this lecture theatre suffering from a highly dangerous syndrome. EPS syndrome. Was ist das, I hear you ask? Edward Petherbridge syndrome. This man has created a wholly fictitious persona for himself. He believes he is a tawdry actor from West Hampstead. He has even gone to the trouble of writing a wholly fictitious autobiography. Slim chances and unscheduled appearances. None of this is true. None of it is real. It is, as you say in English, a load of cod's wallop. He is, in fact, His Royal Highness, King Lear. And he's in a very fragile state. We're a theatre company based in London, and we've been creating the unexpected since 1993. Across the last 27-year history of the company, we have always at some point returned to a classical text. And that has been Shakespeare, or it has been Ostrovsky, the great Russian writer, or American writers Hart and Kaufman. I think we've always been drawn to a classical text because of the spaces in those brilliant texts to create. So not just the language, but the spaces to invent visually and to create a really strong visual world. Obviously Shakespeare, which we've done 3 productions of. We did Comedy of Errors with the Royal Shakespeare Company in England and New York, and then we did a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream with the Svenska Theatre in Helsinki with a mix of Finnish actors and British actors. And then our show My Perfect Mind is in many ways a kind of deconstructed version of King Lear. And of course, Shakespeare, when you go back to it, always surprises you, always challenges you, and always provokes you. So I can imagine us always at some point returning to Shakespeare. Specifically with the Shakespeare, I think we wanted to try and bring them alive, maybe to an audience who aren't used to seeing Shakespeare. So our Comedy of Errors, and originally with the RSC, was aimed to start with at school children, kind of 9 years old, who hadn't necessarily seen any Shakespeare. So we wanted to be able to suck them into a world and a story where they could engage with it, not just through the language, but through what they see. And we've always been passionate about our work reaching the widest possible audience. I mean, we often say we make theatre for anyone who breathes. I think Shakespeare's can be brilliantly accessible. So I think, yes, we were drawn to it for that reason. But I think also there's a sense of wanting to create a whole world theatrically. For me, the great thing about Shakespeare is it's a long way from naturalism or psychological realism. In fact, I'd go so far as to say when you try to apply the rules of naturalism to Shakespeare, it doesn't work. You know, in Shakespeare you have a statue that comes to life, or a bear chases someone off stage. So it's way beyond the confines of a naturalistic drama. And I think at Told by an Idiot we've always embraced the artifice of performance, and I think that's Shakespeare as well. There are so many Shakespeares going on in Britain. I mean, I suppose he is our greatest writer, ranging from obviously the big companies like the Globe Theatre and the RSC down to the smallest companies. I don't feel precious about the Shakespeare. I think sometimes there is too much of it. But I understand why. Everybody considers him our greatest writer, so he'll always be there for sure. Shakespeare remains relevant because he holds a mirror up to the human condition. And I think he does that brilliantly, like no one else does. So it tells us who we are. It shows us who we are. So a play like King Lear, which we deconstructed in My Perfect Mind, deals with that notion of human frailty, of recognition, of how we are with our children. And I think it's extraordinary that you think there was this man living in a small town in England in 400 years ago that managed to create a sequence of plays that tell us who we are. And I think that's why they remain relevant fundamentally. If I think about some of the best productions of Shakespeare that I've seen, I remember seeing a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream in the early 1990s in London by a company called Footspan. And Footspan were founded in Britain, in Cornwall, but then they left for Europe and worked in Spain and Italy. And I saw Midsummer Night's Dream in a tent in a field in London. I'd never seen anything like it. It was the funniest production of Midsummer Night's Dream. As I said, it felt closer to the circus in its form. And then sometimes I think I've been very interested in plays that you don't see so much by Shakespeare. And then I remember seeing a wonderful production of Titus Andronicus, which in some ways is probably Shakespeare's most violent, bloody play. And Deborah Warner had directed it in such a startling way. And she managed to combine the dark violence with the comedy. And I'd not seen that before, and I thought, that's amazing. And all of that is in the play. And I think that was a big influence, because at Told by an Idiot, we've always been fascinated by trying to inhabit the space between laughter and pain. And I think Shakespeare does that brilliantly as well. It's interesting when we talk about the problems of doing Shakespeare, because of course there are. And I remember certainly being involved in a production at the Globe Theatre of Troilus and Cressida. One moment in rehearsal where the director was struggling, we were all struggling with the point where you had the characters of Cressida with her new lover, and Troilus was observing them with Pandarus, so they could see them, the others couldn't see them. And then I was also observing. And we thought, how do we have all these people observing each other? And we had people hiding behind a pillar and hiding behind a tree. And then suddenly someone said, what if we don't hide at all? What if the person who is watching walks directly between the two people who are talking and they don't acknowledge him? And suddenly they existed in different worlds, but in the same space. And that's what I mean about the theatricality. It was a problem, but suddenly when we just embraced the fact that he couldn't be seen by the other characters, the audience completely accepted it. And that's what I mean about the power of the storytelling, is sometimes much stronger than trying to make sense of it. And I think the problem sometimes for a modern audience and a modern actor is something that was funny 400 years ago isn't funny now. The language is archaic. You don't understand the reference. So I think sometimes it becomes even more important to find the visual comedy or the visual humour of the situation, so that even if an audience doesn't quite understand the line itself, there is a visual connection to it that a contemporary audience can laugh at. We don't have an overall approach to Shakespeare. It's not like a way we do it. We respond to each particular play that we've done. So for instance, with Comedy of Errors, which is Shakespeare's maddest play, most anarchic play, it's basically a play which takes place in 24 hours, where one group of twins arrive in a place where there are an identical set of twins. The whole city is infected by a kind of madness. That's how extreme it is. And it's very funny potentially. But my approach to it was, we were often very influenced by film more than theatre. So I was at the time, very influenced by a Yugoslavian film director called Amir Kusturica. And with my designer and composer, we all watched a film of his called Black Cat, White Cat. And it's a crazy world in this story. You know, an old man is in bed in hospital and a brass band comes in to take him out of the bed, and they all carry him and the band is playing as they take him out. So it was this spirit that I said, I want to capture something of that spirit which I think will connect to the Shakespeare. And the other thing I said to my composer is I would like all of the actors to become a band. So we worked very hard to get the right actors who could play the instruments. And for the first week of rehearsal, every morning we didn't look at the script, we just played music. And I think that's a very unusual approach. If you went into most rehearsal rooms in England, you start from the script. You start by reading the play. We didn't. We started by making a band, and they played every morning and learnt this music. The great thing about working like that was that when we started to go to the play, they really listened to each other. Because of course, to play music, you have to listen to each other. With something like My Perfect Mind, the starting point for that production was the true story of a brilliant classical English actor called Edward Petherbridge. He was going to play King Lear in New Zealand, and he flew out to New Zealand. After a day's rehearsal, that evening in his hotel, he had a massive stroke and couldn't do the play. So he went overnight from knowing the biggest part in Western literature to not being able to put his finger and thumb together. And I thought this was extraordinary. And he made a recovery. But his memory wasn't so strong to learn lots of lines. However, he had retained all the memory of the Shakespeare. So we decided to make a show that was about him not playing King Lear, and at the same time, we kept cutting to Lear. So he played King Lear and I would play Cordelia and the Fool. And My Perfect Mind, I think, it captures so much of what our company is about, I think. It couldn't be anything other than theatre. It can only exist in that environment. It's not a film, television, it's definitely theatre. And I think it combines, as I said, a man's life and the parallel of King Lear. It looks at the fragility of the human condition. Hopefully, there's a level of invention. Wherever it's gone, people seem to both laugh, but then also go with this poignant story of this older actor who couldn't do King Lear, but then in our show, he kind of does do King Lear. And I think there's something very redemptive about that. It celebrates a friendship between me and the older actor. So it's a combination, I think, of hopefully our playful experimentation and looking through a prism at the story of King Lear. 95% of our work is made through improvisation. We like to give ourselves enough time before rehearsal, so we have a period of research and development. So prior to going to rehearsal, we'll have 2 or 3 weeks of research and development, which are separate to rehearsal. And we'll go into a room with the actors and designers, and we'll ask ourselves various questions about the idea that we then investigate. We don't need to answer the questions. So for instance, in the Comedy of Errors thing, this idea of music, I remember in the research and development, I said, well, what is this music? So in the week, we experimented with looking at the music from the Yugoslavian film, and we weren't going to copy that, but we looked at that. And then through the instruments that the actors could play, we found our own style of music that was inspired or informed by the movie. So that's often what happens in the research and development. Then we go into a rehearsal for maybe 5 or 6 weeks. If we're working on, say, a Shakespeare, like I said, we don't spend a lot of time reading it. We make sure we understand the story of the scene, and then very quickly we're on our feet and we're doing it. I think sometimes people can feel they understand the Shakespeare when they sit down and they've been analysing it, but you only really understand it when you're up and doing it. I think that can happen a lot. You can think, oh, I know what that line means. And then when you're suddenly on your feet, you go, oh, that's what I'm trying to do to that person, or that's what that person's doing to me. So we try to make it very active very quickly. We're trying to find almost a visual equivalent for everything that is said in the play as well. So we're trying to find a visual language which can tell that story as well. So it's not all carried by the words. And also, we're not precious about the Shakespeare. We will cut it, we will change it, we will move the order around. And some people don't agree with that, but for us, it's a living, breathing thing. And I think it's important when you approach it, that you approach it like this play has never been done before. We often say when we do Shakespeare, imagine if this was a brand new play. So we try to treat it freshly every time. I think sometimes we can be very reverential to the classic. I remember seeing a wonderful Chinese play at the RSC, and it was kind of like Hamlet. The approach to the story felt very irreverent, felt very playful. That's the advice I'd give, is that in a sense they're only stories. They might have wonderful poetry, all of those things, but at the essence it's a story. And I think that's why I think it's important that you throw that story around. You take risks with that story and how you tell it. So I think it's a bit like, for me, the advice would be that you want to have the tension between respecting the story and being irreverent with the classical thing as well. So if you're too respectful, it will be too conservative and it will be could be very boring. So the key to something like Shakespeare is Shakespeare has survived all this time, not just because, as I said, it tells you about the human condition, but it can withstand lots of different ways of doing it. That's what's so amazing. You can do it in so many different ways. There's not one way of doing it. So sometimes in Britain, there is a conservative end of the audience who go, no, Shakespeare should be like that. And that's fine, but that's not the only way it has to be. And I think that's it, is finding your own voice, your own expression of whatever this classical text is you're doing.